put aside in order to cover for people who can't afford to pay because they don't meet the minimum repayment threshold. That's getting so high that the new system is actually going to be more expensive than the one that it replaced. What does all this do to you as students? Well, one thing that I'm interested in and that we need to know more about is your role as students in a more marketised system and whether you identify more as consumers. This caught my eye a couple of weeks ago. At an American university, someone had a campaign called Think Before You Ink, pointing out that the cost of a printer each month is equivalent to 4,000 tacos or 1,000 gallons of gas. Someone wrote underneath, with my tuition fees, I could pay for 40,000 tacos, 10,000 gallons of gas, or 465 tickets to Disney World. I think one of the things that we have to do is adapt to this new landscape, because we need to think and realise that maybe the marketised system places you in a different relationship to us than that which we traditionally assumed. One final graph that I'm going to show you before I hand over. And this is a graph which compares the UK system of higher education funding to that in the rest of the world. The blue line, the dark blue line, is the amount of private expenditure that goes into higher education. The light blue line is the amount of public expenditure. The first thing you'll probably notice is that we're down towards the right-hand side of this graph. So in total, we're not as well funded as other competitive countries. And the other thing you'll notice is the dark blue line is very heavy and the light blue line is very light. In other words, our public expenditure on higher education is much less than most of our competitor countries. These figures come from 2010. They're from the UK, so they include Scotland and Ireland, where proportionally, in terms of GDP, more is spent. And they also are pre-higher fees. So now that blue line would be even bigger. So we live in a context where there isn't much public funding for higher education. We also live in a society where there isn't a great deal of fairness and equity in pre-18 educational systems. Different people have different opportunities and that results in different outcomes. What can we do as a university? In some ways we can't change the whole system, but I think the main thing that I'd argue we need to do is make sure we're not complicit in making things any worse and doing our best as a socially responsible university to correct as much as we can and to make people aware of the other problems in society. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. I found that informative and fascinating. I thought I'd begin with a question that was posed at a conference I was at recently, which is, what's a university for? And the best answer I heard was, for public good. We can argue about that and debate it, as we have increasing numbers of private universities, but I think a public university such as this one should aim to be for public good. Obviously, that good can be delivered in a number of different ways, and a very important way in which it's delivered is our graduates. We also impart new knowledge, we undertake scholarship, and we commit to various other activities outside the university. So in thinking about what is the value of a higher education or the purpose of a higher education, I think a fundamental point is that knowledge for its own sake is a hugely beneficial thing for an individual and for society. For the reasons that Steve told you, it's civilizing, but I think just a greater knowledge and a greater understanding is highly beneficial. In many universities such as this one, I would hope that students benefit from learning in a research-intensive environment, where you're not simply told the facts about your discipline, but where you're side by side with people who are researching at the forefront of knowledge in that discipline. And of course, leaving university with a degree, it does give you more earning power. It's a recognition of achievement and attainment. But talking to employers, and we have a large number of employers that we're engaged with in the university, it's interesting to hear that your discipline doesn't matter very much for most future careers. Most employers are much more interested in the sort of programme you've undertaken and the sort of university you've been to, and indeed in some of the activities you've undertaken outside of your academic studies. Of course, that doesn't apply when you are taking a course that is very, very geared towards a profession, medicine, dentistry, engineering, and so on. But those wider skills include communication, problem solving, independence of thought, awareness, team playing. And these are increasingly important components, I think, of university education, and I hope that it's something we can increasingly deliver. Steve highlighted a really important issue about higher education in this country, and that is the participation, and particularly participation according to wealth, which is very heavily skewed. You'll know we try to put a lot of effort and a lot of money into recruiting students to this university from disadvantaged backgrounds. And contrary, I think, to the national findings, we find, at least over the last 3 years, that students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds achieve as well in their final degree, even if they come in with slightly lower A-level grades, which suggests that they are certainly inherently as capable and perhaps being able to show their potential. However, what we have found is that it's more difficult for them to get employment. And that is probably something that Steve referred to about contacts, about having friends of family and so on, who can make those contacts for them. And so that's something that I think we really need to address very strongly. But university, I hope, is very much more than academic achievement, gaining new knowledge, and indeed achieving a degree. And it's something that I say to students when they graduate, that if you leave this university with a piece of paper and some letters after your name, we failed you and you may have failed yourselves. Because I hope university is a place that challenges your beliefs, that makes you feel uncomfortable at times, that challenges your political, your cultural, your ethnic prejudices. It certainly did for me. And if it doesn't do that for you, then I think it is a wasted opportunity. University is often the most formative time when students decide on their opinions for the rest of their life. There are many opportunities within this university to participate in debates, sometimes difficult debates, sometimes you may not agree with what the arguments are, but I think participate you certainly should. It's also an incredibly important social experience. There is almost no other progression you could make from school where you would be with hundreds of people from different backgrounds, from different countries, from different beliefs. And we know that many lifelong friends are made at university, indeed even future partners for life. Ideally, and I recognise this doesn't always happen, university should be a transformational experience. It should be an occasion, a time when you transform from a set of views perhaps to another set of views. Or indeed those views are reinforced, and perhaps quite rightly so. I do finally want to make a couple of comments on the issues that were raised by Rosie at the beginning, which is about a university and its society and its community. And we happen to live in a thriving city with much poverty and deprivation. And I think it's extremely important that a university like ours, and indeed the one next door to us, Manchester Metropolitan, participates in activities locally. A lot of that participation is through students. Many of you spend many, many hours volunteering in local communities, and that's hugely valuable. We participate in getting people, long-term unemployed people, back into work, in working with elderly people who are lonely. We work with people perhaps who can't read and helping them. And we also work very closely with our partners in the city council, whether it's education, health, transport, or infrastructure. And I think that's right, that's something a university like this should do. But above all else, a university is a place of students. Without students, it shouldn't be called a university, and it doesn't participate as a university. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We now have Paul Cottrell, Head of Democratic Services at UCU.
Thank you very much. I'd like to answer the question very directly. What is higher education for? I think there are four main purposes to higher education. I'd like to tell you what each one is and then compare it with the reality of UK higher education at the moment. Purpose number one, to inspire and enable individuals to develop their capabilities to the highest potential levels throughout their lifelong learning. What's the reality? The reality is we've seen in this country the demolition of lifelong learning. Just last week, this government announced 19% cut in adult skills budget for England between now and 2016. A 90% cut in the adult skills budget, one of the most important areas of lifelong learning, where we desperately need more resources to get adults into education and all the benefits that flow from that for them. A 17.5% cut in funding for 18-year-olds was announced last week. You won't have seen much about it in the press, but very important for 18-year-olds, particularly those in FE colleges, their opportunities are going to be reduced significantly by that cut. And finally, a 42% cut in the teaching grant for higher education. What's left of it? Because, of course, most of it is now provided through your fees, not through public funding. But a further 42% cut in what is left. And I think that all of this simply shows you what we can expect to see over the coming years when we see even more drastic cuts in public expenditure. So that's the reality of the funding situation in terms of having the resources to enable us to meet that purpose of providing lifelong learning for all our citizens to bring them to their highest possible potential. What we've had in this country over recent years is a vast expansion in higher education, while we failed at the same time, as Steve showed, significantly to extend the benefits of higher education throughout our population. It is still very much a selective based system which very much depends on your wealth and your background determining your opportunities for access to higher education. So I think the first purpose is very much in doubt at the moment and very much at risk. Second purpose of higher education, I believe, is to increase knowledge and understanding for their own sake, for the intrinsic benefits of the pursuit of truth, the gathering of new knowledge, the development of research. What's the reality? Well, actually, UK higher education research record has really held up quite well through the cuts. However, the way that has been achieved is by concentrating resources to conduct research and scholarship in our institutions into fewer and fewer institutions. And I think the result of that has been to deprive many very bright, talented academics from the very opportunity to get engaged in research because of those policies of concentration and selectivity of research funding. Third purpose, to contribute to the development of an adaptable, sustainable, knowledge-based economy, locally, regionally, and internationally. What's the reality? An interpretation of education for work, which I think is very narrowly instrumentalist, and based on a set of policies which are about privatization, marketization, about forcing institutions into competition with each other. I think a very destructive process of competition, which simply has divided our education system, stratified our higher education institutions into groupings, the Russell Group and the various other groupings of institutions, with different levels of provision, different levels of quality, and very different student bodies as well, through the selectivity process that I talked about earlier on. And what also has been based on, of course, is this disastrous tuition fee regime. I say disastrous, it's disastrous from whichever way you look at it. At the moment, the government is predicting that the student loans that students have taken out, that 48% of those loans will never be repaid.